Thank you all for joining. We're excited to welcome you to our live webinar titled Grow Your Agency's Valuation by Making Yourself More Optional at Work. For those of you who don't know about Productive, Productive is an end-to-end agency management software. In Productive, agencies of all types and sizes can manage their business operations from sales, budgeting, resource planning, to project management, time tracking, reporting, and billing. Today, however, we're going to talk about agency valuations. So to introduce myself first, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Maria, and I focus on understanding the digital agency landscape and what drives agency leaders. And with me today is Karl Sakas, agency advisor at Sakas Company, who I'd like to welcome now. Hi, Karl. Thanks for joining.
Maria, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. So what we're going to cover today, first, we're going to go through a brief history of Sakas Company. We're going to cover what we like to call your role, your choice, or basically choosing your ideal future. Why making yourself optional helps you get a higher valuation, and where you should focus next if you're feeling that you're not optional yet. We'll go through the stages of being optional. And basically, what we'll also include for you at the end are some valuable resources for agency leaders. So without further ado, please, Karl, tell us a bit about yourself. How are you even doing today? And if I understand correctly, Sakas Company has worked with hundreds and hundreds of agencies worldwide. Can you please give us some background on yourself?
Sure. And by the way, I'm looking forward to answering as many questions as can. I know people can submit those. So I look forward to answering those. So Karl Sakas here, agency advisor. As Marie mentioned, I've worked directly supporting hundreds of agencies on every inhabited continent, typically with a focus on helping the owners work less and earn more, while helping their team up-level and create new opportunities for growth while making life easier and more profitable for the owner. In addition to writing, at this point, over 400 articles on agency management, I've also written 3 books, most recently, Work Less, Earn More, How to Escape the Daily Grind of Agency Ownership, which is available on Amazon worldwide, both digitally and in print. I love helping agencies, coming from an agency operations background, helping agency leaders calm the chaos of agency life.
Nice. So we know every agency, every digital agency, business consultancy, whatever category we fall into as an agency is kind of a world of its own, right? What kinds of similarities did you find like a common denominator?
One of the big things is around where the agency owners want to go. And I've identified a continuum. Most people lean toward either running a lifestyle agency, keep running the agency, or they're looking for some sort of an exit. I would call that an equity-oriented agency. And getting clear on that helps you understand all of the decisions you make from here onward. So, for instance, here on this slide, here are 4 options for your agency's ideal future. The first one is lifestyle. You might lean toward running a lifestyle agency, profitable agency, not planning to sell it. You could also bring in an outside investor or more than one investor, where you are not selling all of the business, but you're getting a cash infusion. You might be looking for a merger where you continue to be involved in the agency, but now you're co-running it or a larger firm with others. And for many people, they're looking for an exit altogether, where at some point after the deal is closed, they move on 100% to something new. The key is you need to find the right choice for you so that you can make it happen.
Sure. So what you're basically saying is either one of these options, either one of these paths is really feasible, but it's kind of up to you to choose your ideal future.
I would start by getting clear on what you want your ideal to be, because then you can work backwards to make it happen. That's right.
Sure. So let's break this down. Sorry. So choosing your ideal future, what does that look like for each of these paths?
And as people are listening along, either live or in the recording, think about which of these seems most appealing to you. Lifestyle, you might say, I want to keep running the agency. I've had some lifestyle-oriented agency owners who would say, well, I don't want to sell the business. I would just go off and start a new agency. So I want to fix the one I have, get things running smoothly, make it work out. In that case, it's going to be keep running the agency. This tends to be a good match for people who love agency work and who enjoy generally the challenges that come with running an agency, as long as they can get some of the more annoying ones settled down. They just love the work and they want to keep doing it. That's lifestyle. Now, bringing in an outside investor can be a good option if you are perhaps lifestyle oriented, but you're looking for some sort of a cash infusion where someone would buy typically a majority stake of the agency and you continue running it. And there may be some other changes along the way. This helps you take some money, off the table from the business into your pocket personally. A key there is that the investor is buying into you and your vision because you are not exiting the business completely. That's the bring in an investor option. And
Sure.
again, usually you'd be selling majority stake. The third option is doing a merger. There's been a trend toward agencies merging over the past years. And one of the big things that agencies consider if they were doing acquisitions through a merger is they're trying to build up their own revenue. They're trying to grow their revenue and profit margins faster than if they were growing organically, usually because they're trying to do a bigger exit.
Sure.
For instance, if there's a agency with a $2 million revenue and 3 and 4 and all, and you add it up, eventually you can get above the $10 million revenue threshold that a lot of larger acquirers are looking for. So you're basically bolting together an agency. There are challenges with that for sure, but mergers, joining forces, and any new partners are buying into both you and the business. Some may not be looking for a future exit, but that's most common with the merger approach. And the final one is exit, which is what I think a lot of people think about, where they're like, I'm tired of running the business, I'm ready to move on. Sometimes they're tired because of burnout. Other times they're approaching a point where they'd like to retire and step back. The exit option ultimately is selling completely to another party. There may be some sort of an earn-out where you have to stick around for a bit, but ultimately it's not a permanent involvement situation. And in this case, the acquirer is buying both the agency as well as the book of business, including, for instance, looking at how recurring your revenue is or not. So,
Sure.
As people are listening, which of these seem most appealing? You can work toward making it happen, but you need to be clear on where you want to go.
Sure. And as this final option, preparing an exit, this kind of brings us to our next point, which is the core of our webinar. So how does this term, as you coined, as being more optional, what is being optional all about, and what is it? Can you explain this term?
I define optional as a situation where you, as the agency owner, don't have to be involved constantly in day-to-day operations. That is, you've got a very strong team. They are managing those day-to-day tasks. You tend to be, I think of it as being the fire marshal, not the firefighter, right? You are not going in and putting out fires all day long. You are perhaps thinking through, how do we prevent them in the future? And ideally, you've hired a really strong number two who has their own support team to take care of all of that for you. And you're getting, occasional updates. Agencies usually are not going to be fully hands-off, but ultimately when you're optional, things are running smoothly. You're managing day-to-day tasks. And importantly, you as the owner, when you're optional, get to focus on the things you like doing. And what you like doing, that's unique to you. That'll vary. Some people, for instance, love building partnerships and doing sales, or maybe they don't have to, but that's what they like doing. Other people really like operations. And the key is you can do what you choose to do when you're optional rather than what you have to do.
Okay, yeah, I see. So, but what if we're not optional yet? That's the main question.
The good news is you can become increasingly optional. And of course, remember, the more optional you are, the better evaluation you can get. And whatever potential exit, merger, investor deal you could negotiate. And even if you lean toward lifestyle, that's totally fine. The more optional you are, the more fun it is. So I've identified in my work across ultimately hundreds of agencies, I've identified 4 stages in day-to-day involvement. And as people are listening along, think about which of these seem to be where you are today. And indeed, you can be in more than one stage at once. So stage 1, which was probably what you experienced in the early days, that's mandatory. And we could think of this as a fuel gauge, a gas gauge, a petrol gauge. Stage 1 is your mandatory. You can never get away. Everything's on fire. If you go out to lunch, you can expect to come back and something is broken. That's stage 1, mandatory. You can move up to stage 2, necessary, where it's a little bit better, right? You can be away for a few days. Your team's making some decisions, getting some things done for you. The problem is sometimes they make poor decisions, they make things worse, and ultimately you may dread taking time away from the business because things often are worse because you weren't there. Now, stage 3, needed, that is needed, not necessary, is where things get a lot better. When you're needed, you can go on vacation for a week and things probably will be fine. You're probably usually not interrupted. And a lot of people choose to stay at needed. But if you're looking to do an exit where you are eventually or immediately stepping out of the business, you want to pursue stage 4, optional. When you are optional, you are just that. You do things that you do because you want to do them, not because you have to do them. Keep in mind that you can be in more than one stage at once. For instance, you might be mandatory or necessary as the sales closer, but you might be optional for doing the initial screening, for instance. Or maybe you're needed when it comes to marketing strategy, but your team is fulfilling all of the strategic work from there.
Sure. That's understandable. So here we have kind of like the what we can call swim lanes, right? So the quality of life
Yeah.
and how we can move up. So from
Yeah. So
go ahead.
the key here, people, well, how do I get better? And there's a specific thing you can focus on to go from stage 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. Now, there are more than just these, 1 per step things, but consider that every stage you move up from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, your quality of life improves. So what if you want to go from mandatory, your mandatory say, and you want to get to stage 2, necessary? That requires what I call swim lanes, defining swim lanes about who is in charge of what at your agency, both who's going to do something and who's not going to do something. Something that people often run into is either, say there are 2 owners at an agency, both of them are theoretically in charge of something, which means sometimes they're duplicating their efforts, or sometimes no one is in charge of something and things don't get done at all. Something I'll do as I start working with agencies in my advising work is asking for a team census, including who reports to whom. And sometimes when I ask, who is a particular person's manager, it's, 2 people, or maybe 3 people, or I'm not sure. And you know what? If you're not sure as the manager or as the agency owner, your team is even more confused, and confusion does not lead to making yourself optional. So you've gone from stage 1 to stage 2 using swim lanes. You're getting clear on who's doing what, who's not doing what. How about going from stage 2 to stage 3, from necessary to needed, making that big leap? And we've got that line.
Sorry, we lost you for a moment, Carl. I think we have some technical difficulties. Maybe your audio.
Is that any better?
You're back here. You're back.
Did that help?
Yeah, it did. It did. Sorry, please.
Okay. Uh, so what was the last part that you'd heard?
So now we're going from necessary to needed, and what are the requisites for that?
Yeah, so it's a concept I call values, goals, and resources, VGR. The idea is that every agency operates according to certain values, how you encourage people to make decisions, goals around what you're trying to accomplish, and resources in terms of time, money, people, software, what have you, to get things done. And there are VGRs, values, goals, and resources at the agency level. There are also values, goals, and resources at the individual client level. Each client has their own VGRs. The more you can clarify values, goals, and resources in advance to your team, the less often they are going to interrupt you with questions about what to do, because they'll understand the constraints involved and they won't have to ask you every single time. That is critical to go from stage 2 to stage 3, necessary to move up to need it.
Sure. However, I have a question here. So I know you did
Yeah.
point out, but maybe we could just for the audience go through it once again. Needed and necessary kind of sounds similar. What is the main difference between being in these two stages?
So the main difference is confidence in stepping away.
Sure.
For instance, if you're needed, you could probably go on vacation for a week and things will probably be fine. If you are merely necessary, stage 2, you can go away for just a few days and you can be confident that something went wrong. Those two words, by the way, came from a phrase that investor Mark Cuban mentioned, where he said that as an investor, he wants to be needed, not necessary. Now, I've adapted this to agency leadership, but in his original version, he was saying if he is investing in a business, he wants his investment to be needed. That is, they need the money. It's going to help them grow, help them accomplish things, but it is not necessary. If an investment is necessary, he's saying the firm would go out of business if he didn't invest. So I've applied that here. The idea is that your leadership is needed, but it's not that necessary to the point that everything will fall apart without you.
Sure, understood. Thanks. Now let's move on to being optional.
Yeah. So if some people are happy to stay in stage 3, needed, and if you lean fully toward running a lifestyle agency, staying needed can be just fine. But I suspect if you're listening today, you want to increase your valuation, you're probably interested in stage 4, becoming optional. And that ultimately comes down to hiring the right people and coaching them on succeeding in their role. Keep in mind that some people are never going to be a match. That's why you need to hire the right people. But even if you have the right people in the roles, you need to coach them and support them on growing and moving into their future roles. For a lot of people, that involves creating a ramp-up plan, especially if you want to promote someone internally or hire externally to find a number 2 to run your agency for you day to day and maybe even take over eventually as CEO. The key is that there needs to be a ramp-up. Maybe someone is, for instance, the director of client services. Maybe they move into a vice president role. And maybe eventually they move to a general manager or COO role, chief operating officer. And eventually, if you choose, and assuming they've succeeded in the ramp up along the way, maybe eventually they would become CEO. The key is that you can't expect people to immediately take over for you without any kind of a ramp up. It is not likely to go well if you just throw them in the deep end. That would be what I would call abdication, which is not good, rather than delegation, which is good.
Sure. This is really interesting stuff. Can it really apply to the majority of agency owners or, high-level agency managers that you've worked with? Is this a tested and proven method?
Well, I've used it with hundreds of agencies, so I would say yes on the tested and proven. There is one case where this kind of thing won't work. And that's unique to an individual agency owner. Sometimes, as I'm doing my agency coaching, people say, you know what, I just don't like managing people. And the reality is, unless you are at the point that you can move your agency to make yourself fully optional, if you're an agency owner, you are managing people. You are at minimum managing your COO, who may be managing everyone else, but more often, if you've delegated that way, you might be, say, you're the CEO, you've got a COO who's overseeing delivery, but you're still probably overseeing the growth side of the business, marketing, sales, and partnerships, and things like that. If you just don't like managing people, I don't know if running an agency is the right match.
Sure.
So keep that in mind. I think the one major exception. If you don't like managing people, consider shifting to a solo operation rather than an agency.
Sure. Do you see many people getting to the needed area and kind of stage needed, and then trying to kind of like being in a limbo, not knowing whether or not to become more optional or stay in needed?
I think sometimes people who get stuck in stage 3, needed, ultimately either aren't ready to make certain changes, to like let go of things, to move to optional. Maybe they haven't had the role models in their previous experience as an employee. Maybe if they've always had dysfunctional bosses, right? You just know what you know and things like that. And it is helpful at that point to get outside perspective, whether that's from a coach, from a consultant, from a mastermind group, or something like that, to get some perspective. And you know what, even as I advise clients on delegation, until somewhat recently, I was sending invoices myself. Of course, running a consulting, coaching, and training business rather than a larger agency. But you know what? Once I started delegating invoicing to my colleague Kate, you know what? She does it better than I do. So, if people are reluctant to let go, I would take a look at, is that about your team? Like they're not ready, or they don't have the time, they don't want to do it, things like that. I call that desire, competence, and capacity. Do they want to do it? Do they know how to do it? And so on. Or is it about you, where you could let go, but you don't want to? And that is a place often where, whether it's coaching or potentially working with a therapist, I've been to therapy on and off for years. If you're just stuck, you're going to have to do things differently rather than keep going the way you've been.
Sure. So before we move on to the final part where our Q&A will be, questions that came up. So for additional free and low cost resources, or anything that we can learn to grow into our optimal roles or get closer to dream exits, what are you suggesting?
Well, I would consider checking out the Work Less, Earn More book. I talk through my step-by-step process. In addition to the book itself, available for Kindle, paperback, and hardcover, Amazon worldwide, if you get the book, you also get free access to a 40-plus page workbook to help you apply what is in the book. When I strategized with my colleague Kate about creating the workbook, the decision was the workbook needs to be robust enough to cannibalize some of our paid programs. So it's pretty good. If you're interested in exploring more, whether that's to get a link to get it on Amazon in your geographic region, get a sample chapter if you want to check it out first, get the free workbook, go to worklessearnmorebook.com. That's worklessearnmorebook.com. And if you're interested in checking out some of the hundreds of articles that I've written to help agencies, those are at sakasandcompany.com, SAKASAND, the word company.com. You can also get my newsletter, which several agency leaders have told me is the email newsletter is the only email they read every time.
That's a great
day
and age.
Yeah.
Great. So thanks. Let's move on to Q&A. We have a few questions lined up here. So the first one would be, do I decide which future option to pursue? So lifestyle, investor, merger, exit. What's critical to decide?
I would start by identifying what is your ideal life separate from the business. As business owners, we tend to be highly, invested, no pun intended, in our business, and it tends to take a lot of our time and emotional bandwidth. I would focus on what do you want from life in general. For instance, do you want to travel? Do you have some hobbies you want to pursue? Is it more time with family members? Do you have potentially some caregiving obligations that you're supporting others? Get clear on what that looks like. For instance,
Sorry, we lost you again, Carl, for a moment. The audio is cut off. Do you think you can check if you're some technical difficulties today? Oh, you're back.
all right. Did that seem to do it? Okay. So get clear on where you want to go. For instance, if you're generally happy running the agency, you just want to increase your compensation or maybe reduce your workload, running a lifestyle agency might be totally fine. If you have other obligations that, outside of work, consider whether or not a merger is right for you. In that case, you want to be clear, is this a merger to build a larger lifestyle agency? Or is there going to be a lot of pressure to grow to do some sort of an exit for the merged business? Like anything involving an outside party, make sure that their goals are at least, if not ideally aligned, but at least complementary to your own.
Sure. I mean, that's also very often a concern of agencies looking to maybe merge or sell. Like, will their goals and their culture align with my own, and vice versa?
Yeah.
But so in essence, basically, even which future option to pursue is at large, it's a lifestyle question. It's what you want your life to become. So it's not just a business question or a career.
For sure. And people can get stuck on this where, for instance, and this is a slightly different version. Sometimes people will say, I have found this great job candidate, should I hire them? That'll come up when I'm doing executive coaching or consulting. And one of the core questions is, do you need their help? What is the business need? Sometimes you might come across a great candidate, but they're not interested in doing the job you need them to do. When your agency has 50 or 100 people, you could afford to hire someone who's promising. If your agency is smaller than that, everyone needs to be, working on things that need to happen rather than necessarily a nice to have.
Sure.
So focus on what you want and work backwards from there.
Sure. Second question, can I be in more stage at the same time, in more than one stage at the same time? So I think we answered this during the presentation, but maybe you can, elaborate some more, or give some examples.
So could you elaborate on that?
So can I be in more than one stage at the same time?
Oh, yes. So for instance, when it comes to maybe say recruiting, maybe you are optional in terms of sourcing candidates, but you might be needed in terms of doing some sort of a final stage interview around culture match. On the other hand, if your agency doesn't have a recruiter, which is true for most agencies, or you don't have, say, an operations manager to lead things, you might be there in the weeds, posting the job, dealing with initial candidate screening, things like that. There are ways to automate that. For instance, you might be able to use applicant tracking systems or other tools to go maybe from mandatory to at least stage 2 on initial screening. And if you're hiring for a particular team within your agency, the manager of the team should be the one leading the hiring process instead of you as the owner.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great example because yeah, I think many agencies have particularly with hiring, it's always like you want to make sure that it's a cultural fit, and then sometimes sometimes the owner can get involved. Third question, how would being more optional improve our agency's multiple?
Consider that if you are selling all or a portion of your business, the acquirer is ultimately thinking, how is this acquisition going to make them money? I had a client in Canada several years ago that had an outside investor, and one of their recurring things was the investors, they only care about making money. Yes, that's what investors do. If you have an investor, whether they're buying all of the business or buying a majority stake, they're not doing it because they're nice. They're doing it because they want to make money. And I mean, I guess in a sense, anyone who has, say, a retirement account or is saving for their kids' college or what have you, you're doing that because you want to make money. You want the account to grow so that it's worth more, so that when you need the money, you have more money than you would have otherwise. So, keep in mind that investors are there to make money. And one of the things they're doing is they're evaluating the health of your business. How critical are you to the agency's operations? If you got sick, or as a boss used to say, got hit by the bread truck, could the agency keep running? If the answer is no, an investor is going to be leery and they're not going to pay you as much. They might look at your profit margins and your EBITDA earnings trends, but they might say, well, you aren't optional. They might not use the four-stage phrases, but they're thinking, well, we want to buy this business, but the business can't operate on its own. Whereas if you're an owner and you have hired someone else to be a hired leader of the business, whether you make them the COO, president, or you've hired them as the CEO, an outside investor is like, oh, well, great. I can just buy out the owner, the head of day-to-day as an employee. We can make a deal for them to stick around, and then the investor can make money that way. So the more optional you are, the better evaluation you're going to get, because the investor sees themselves as basically a more stable way for them to make money.
Yeah, exactly. So the transition will be easier in essence, and anything regarding management, basically your management is more robust and your everything is more robust.
Exactly. And that also ties into, for instance, finding new sales leads. If all of the leads come to your agency through your individual network, it is good that you're getting referrals, but that means that when you leave, those will go away, and you can arrange a referral deal and things like that. But if all of the business is coming from referrals rather than through a robust marketing, sales, and partnership process, an acquirer is going to want to discount whatever they pay for the business, whether fully in an exit or through a merger or an outside investor.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense because down the line you're trying to understand what you're buying and what the future of what you're buying is in essence.
Yeah.
We have some more questions in the Q&A. So maybe we can go through one more and then we'll have to wrap up for today.
All right.
So maybe you can elaborate further on the question, well, the fact that you said that earlier, for example, if you don't like managing people, you shouldn't be in the agency business. Can you expand on that?
Ultimately, if you are the owner of an independently owned agency, you are both owner and operator. If you've ever been driving on the highway and you see a truck that says, we are hiring owner operators, keep in mind that, as an agency owner, you have two roles. You have your owner role, which is you are in charge of the business and you're getting a share of either all or a share of profits, depending on your ownership percentage. But you're also the operator. You might be the CEO of the agency, you might be president, you might have a partner title or something like that. Keep in mind, though, you could hire someone else to be the operator. Or you could also do an exit. I had a client several years ago who wanted to sell his agency. I helped him improve his numbers, and he got hired to stay on as the CEO of the agency. And he had to stay for a certain period of time, but he actually stayed longer because he was glad that he wasn't in charge of everything anymore. So keep in mind that although agency owners tend to see themselves as the owner, you're also usually an operator. You are able to split those. Keep in mind, though, if you are an operator, you are, as is true for most people, involved day to day in running the business. You are managing people. At a minimum, you are managing the number two who is leading everything else, but you're also likely managing people involved in growth in terms of marketing, sales, partnerships. You're still managing people. You know, if you manage a salesperson and they're not producing, you're going to have to coach them. And if they don't fix things, if they're not producing, eventually fire them. That's not fun, but that's part of the job if you are both owning and operating an agency. And some people conclude it's like, you know what, I like the work, but I don't like managing people. In that case, it makes sense to shift toward, for instance, being a freelancer or a consultant where, you know, you're working directly with your clients, but you're not managing people anymore.
Sure. I'm wondering if we have any more time for one more question. How do you stand, Karl?
I'm glad to answer as many as you like.
Sure. So one more question, Karl, based on your experience, are there specific annual revenue thresholds that are associated with the needed and optional roles? Wondering if an agency needs to be a certain size to be able to make these transitions.
It can be hard to become fully optional with fewer than 10 full-time people at the agency, because at that point, you likely don't have role division. Rather than having, say, separate account managers and project managers, you have individual subject matter experts who are doing a bit of everything, which works in the early days, but that means that people can't focus on what they like doing best. You know, maybe you've got someone who is a great client strategist, but they're also an account manager, and they're also a project manager, and they're also updating things on a client's website or, you know, in campaigns or things like that. They're getting pulled in a lot of directions. Usually agencies aren't specializing roles that way. There are 6 agency roles I've identified until they're in the 8 to 12 range, and 15 and up, it tends to be a bit easier. But it's not impossible if you are intentional about it. For instance, I have a client that is almost entirely optional. He's now working 1 day a week on the agency because he has trained up, and I've helped him coach and structure things, his number two, going from a sales role to a director role to a VP, eventually is going to become in charge of things. It's a multi-year process. You could potentially get there faster. The key, though, is that they're being strategic about it, and they're not trying to kind of push people into the higher up roles before they're ready. If you're running your agency and you don't have a strong number two in place, it's going to take longer because you need to find them and you need to ramp them up. But there's also a catch, which is you don't have a good sense of their character. Can you trust them? You know, for instance, when I hired my colleague Diane, she's been on board for 5 years. We had volunteered together for 2 years in a marketing association, and she was super impressive in her volunteering. And I'm like, wow, if she's, you know, imagine if she's doing that when she's not getting paid as a volunteer, if she's paid, and indeed, she has been amazing. So be careful about hiring externally and trying to put something into the role right away. It is possible to become optional fewer than, say, 10 people, but it's a lot easier when you can start specializing, you start having middle management, and then eventually you have someone managing the middle managers rather than everyone reporting to you. That'll help you become optional more smoothly.
Sure. And let's go through this final question and then we'll wrap up. So
Sure.
agencies have constantly been adapting to new practices, strategies, and technologies. What's the most important advice you can give to keep an agency on track and moving in the right direction?
The biggest thing is making time to focus on what's next. I spend a lot of time, reading about agency and business trends beyond the things I'm observing myself. Goals to, read the paper every morning, keeping up with various newsletters about what's going on, things like that. I've created space in my schedule to be able to do that. Whereas if I were running from, putting out fires to putting out another fire and this and that, I wouldn't have time to reflect. And by having that time, I can, for instance, read about one thing and I'll tie it in with a pattern across something else. And that's how I create a lot of my articles. At this point, over 400. Anytime I think of a new article idea, I create a draft in WordPress. And at this point, I have an additional 700 plus drafts of article ideas, anywhere from, a sentence to, almost a full article at this point. So really, it's about giving yourself space. I have a client in Texas who had mentioned he wanted space to be able to think about what's next. And I recommended doing what I would call heads down time. That is putting time on the calendar, whether it's 2 hours, 4 hours, 3 hours, even an hour. Ideally, it's at least a couple hours where no one is interrupting you. And the key is, make sure you explain this to your team, right? I'm heads down during this time. If it's an emergency, here's what would, merit interrupting me. Otherwise, though, give me the question before or after, and I'll take care of it then. That heads down time is really powerful because you can focus on what is most important rather than what is necessarily noisiest in your schedule. And that will help you keep up with what's going on, which is in part can be unique to your agency and client base. It all starts by making space for yourself so that you have time to actually do all of this.
Sure, great. Thanks so much. So to wrap up, I would like you guys to, whoever's watching, for all of you who are interested in this topic, we'd like to invite you to try the agency valuation calculator by Productive. This is a new tool. It's still in beta, but you can get an estimate of the value of your agency business in 5 to 10 minutes if you know your past few years financials. Besides a general idea of the value of your agency, once you filled out the survey, the questionnaire, you'll get a detailed report on the different factors that may influence your agency's valuation as well. As a next step, though, of course, you should always speak to professionals such as Karl and his team. He's got a lot of valuable experience with so many hundreds of agencies, and I'm sure we'll have more questions to answer as well after we follow up. So, and for any other questions on becoming more optional, please feel free to reach out to Karl. I'm gonna add that here. So thank you. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for your time and your expertise, Karl. It was a pleasure. If anyone wants to try out Productive, our end-to-end agency management tool, please feel free to also reach out to me or any of our team and sign up for a demo. Thank you and goodbye.